I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd have to say I'm genuinely looking forward to the debate on this bill. I think it's an important bill. It's challenging. It'll cover some very sensitive topics, and I think there is some space for controversy within some of the proposed provisions within this. Having said that, I would hope that we are able to avoid a political contest over this bill. Because yes, I think we should politicise things like taxes, but death, I think we should endeavour to simply come to the best outcome and put our evidence-based hats on, our sort of serious debating hats. And I have to say that I'm reassured by the quality of some of the contributions we've heard already from Jackie Dean, from Mr Burrows, from my whanaunga, Pene Henare. People are engaging at a very serious level with this, and that's a very positive beginning, I think, to this piece of legislation. I think there's a popular view that coroners are people who are to be found in morgues wearing white coats and waving scalpels about. I think the influence of television programs and the like. That's completely false, of course. The chief coroner, a district court judge, the coroners all with typically lawyers or some legal training. And their task, of course, is to discover the cause and circumstances of sudden or unexplained deaths, with a key focus on seeking to prevent or at least reduce the likelihood of similar deaths occurring, be they by accident, by whatever means that the death occurred. I think just doing some background reading about this stuff, it seems that the budget of the coronial service is rather modest, and this might reflect on the comments we heard about the Kaitaia coroner and his difficulty, or his or her difficulty in meeting the workload demands. The last figure I've seen is something to the tune of 17 million, about half of that which is devoted to paying for specialty services, pathological services, lab tests, those sorts of things. So it seems that it is a service which may be under some financial pressure, and no doubt that's something we'll hear about in the submissions if that be the case. The legislation we're seeking to amend in this legislation, and I don't think I've yet made the point actually that the Greens are intending to support this legislation, just to put that out there. What we're amending is legislation that's relatively, it's not particularly old, it was 2006, saw a fairly major overhaul of the coronial services, the establishment of the Office of the Chief Coroner. The intention and the purpose of that change at that time was to streamline services. It created a network of full-time coroners with legal qualifications, whereas I understand before there were perhaps more people, but sort of a hodgepodge of half-time positions or part-time services which were found to be unsatisfactory. So it's fair to say, I think, that this 8 years down the track, we're looking at the outcome, and clearly the results are, or the anecdotal evidence at least that's presented in the RIS, would indicate that the system is still far from perfect. And some of the perceived problems have been touched on already, particularly in procedural delays, processes that are not delivering swift resolution, and that obviously is significant and very damaging potentially when it's around issues of the return of bodies and allowing families to reclaim their loved ones after sudden deaths. There's enough stress, enough grief without the clumsy legal processes layering another level of concern and stress onto that. So anything we can do to resolve those procedural and process issues, I think we need to sort of bend our minds to that with make some significant effort to ensure that we are streamlining the processes to the extent that we can. I think the point's already been made, and again, this is evidence, or at least anecdotal evidence, that's presented in the RIS about overlap of jurisdiction, about lack of clarity about who's in charge, who can do what, who should be doing what, and these are things that are amenable to improvement, I'm sure. And clearly, as I said, where we have these procedural and process bottlenecks or imperfections, that's not only creating financial cost, but significant social cost as well, and we need to do as much as we can to remedy that. None of these things look to be straightforward, but some, as I say, are amenable to attention to the more mechanistic aspects of the Act, just trying to make it work better. I think where the real controversy will kick in my assessment anyway, is around two provisions of the Act. One of those is changing the requirements about deaths in custody, and the other one, of course, is around the issue of suicides. In terms of the deaths in custody, I guess the primary change, and I'll just quote from the explanatory note, is in removing the requirement for a mandatory inquest into deaths in official custody or care to provide the coroner with more flexibility, particularly when the death is from natural causes and there are no suspicious circumstances. However, the coroner would still be required to hold an inquiry. Putting aside for a minute the difference between an inquest and an inquiry, the key difference, of course, in the matter of holding a hearing. But we've had recent examples of significant concern, challenges, quite high-profile cases around deaths in custody where there has been considerable unhappiness about the results, the findings and the outcomes of those deaths. I'm not going to comment on specific cases because I'm aware that some of them are still either in some sort of legal process now, or potentially there will be legal issues arise around them. But in general terms, I think it's fair to say that deaths in custody have been seriously challenged as to liability, the circumstances leading up to a death. I think part of the problem there is that, and I perceive it as a problem, others may not, that the fact that medical services within our prisons, people providing those medical services are employees of the Corrections Department. And I advocate very strongly that there ought to be an independent organisation, be it a DHB or whatever, who provides the medical services, health services in our prisons, simply to draw that bright line between a focus on containment, if you like, and the focus on delivery of health services. And I think some of that has come through into controversy around some of the more recent high-profile deaths in custody. It's not only prisons, of course, it's people detained under alcohol and drug addiction legislation, young people who are kept in residences, mental health detainees. So there is a raft of people in police custody, people in custody of security officers while being transported. There is a raft of situations where people in custody have passed away, and often in circumstances that are obviously unnatural. But I'm sure there will be unease about this change from a mandatory inquest to simply to an inquiry. And it's something I think we need to investigate, to invite submissions and to look very hard at the costs and benefits around that. The other issue, of course, is around suicides, and I think I entirely understand what the legislation seeks to do, is to manage the reporting of suicides, to take away the opportunity for these things to be sensationalised, to try and manage the risk of copycat suicides, particularly with young people. So on that side, there are very sound arguments, which I generally agree with, to control the release of information about suicides. Alongside that, and not necessarily in conflict with it though, is an advocacy for actually talking more about suicide, particularly with young people. And I've been involved around the margins with groups in Northland. The RATS is one of them, are Riders Against Teen Suicide. We discover that a bunch of people on noisy, shiny motorcycles coming into a town attracts the attention of young people, and they're open their ears. And I just acknowledge Arthur Harawira, who's been driving some of that, to having suffered a tragedy in his own life around this, who is passionate about trying to ensure that our young people do not see suicide as an option. We can only do that by talking to them in very carefully managed situations to endeavour to get that plague of suicides out of our communities, out of our young people, and not least of all in Northland, where there is a very serious problem that's already been mentioned. So I think we'll have to carefully manage that to ensure that people don't perceive that by endeavouring to manage better the reporting of suicides and events around suicides, we're not trying to shut down the debate. So I look forward to this ongoing debate. We'll support this legislation.
Mr Speaker,
I call Dennis